I'm Paul Olson, the artist who gave the USS Enterprise her pearl ball gown for Star Trek, the motion picture. And you are now listening to TREKPOD on the UFP network.
UFP, the United Federation of Podcasts.
Hi, I'm Tony Robinson, and welcome to the second edition of TREKPOD. Our guest today is Richard Winn Taylor II, who in 1973 joined the TV and commercial special effects company Robert Abel and Associates. He served 6 years as director and art director, and during his time won 4 Clio Awards for his work on the 7-Up Bubbles and Oncola and Levi's trademark commercials. As fans of Star Trek, we know Richard better as the designer and overseer of the refit USS Enterprise NCC-1701. Later in 1980, Richard became the creative director at Information International Incorporated, one of the first companies to specialize in computer-generated imagery, and became the co-effects director of the innovative special effects and CGI images used in Walt Disney's Tron, a movie that introduced the world to computer simulation. Richard is here with us on TREKPOD to outline his early beginnings in the design industry and to highlight some background details on his work on Star Trek, the motion picture.
Dock control reports ready, sir.
Helm ready, sir.
Orbital departure on plot, sir. Yard command signaling clear, sir.
Maneuvering thrusters, Mr. Sulu. Maneuvering thrusters, sir. Hold station. Thrusters at station keeping, sir.
Where were you when you first heard about the proposal to make Star Trek the motion picture?
You know, my involvement all stemmed from my being the kind of main art director designer at Robert Abel and Associates, the computer graphic design effects house in Los Angeles. And somewhere the latter part of 1977, we started to interface with Paramount. The film itself, as has well been documented, was initially being built and cast, and all the work was being done for it to be a television feature, not a new series, but basically a television feature. And so lots of work had been done on the film, and sets had already begun to be made. It had been cast. There was a few other things which we'll get into that were underway. You have to remember this was, 1977, 78, and the special effects facilities in LA were very limited. It was not as it is now. There was Doug Trumbull and his group, and they were busy and behind schedule on Close Encounters. There was John Dykstra and his group, who had done Star Wars, of course, but they were also booked up as they were then doing Battlestar Galactica. And then it dropped right off from there. There were no other really special effects houses that shot models the way that had evolved. The other effects facilities, be it Linwood Dunn or something like that, had done movies back in the 50s and 60s and had that kind of technology like Mad Mad World and all that. So right about that time, in the latter part of the 70s, there was this wave that was coming through of new technology in the way to shoot imagery with motion control cameras. The Dykstra Flex, of course, which made the Star Wars look the way it did. There was a huge breakthrough in the cinematography, the miniature photography in that movie. 2001, objects weren't moving quickly, and so there wasn't motion blur. And so all of the details that evolved out of that work and the work that Trumbull was doing on Close Encounters and he had done on Silent Running and so forth. So there were very few options. And the Able Studio at that time was really we were getting a lot of publicity and press because we were doing Slit Scan and Streak, and it was on national television, so we had a big buzz. And Con Pedersen worked at the Able Studio, who happened to have been one of the effects directors on 2001. So a combination of things boiled down to that the studio didn't have any options, and they really rolled the dice and thought that the Able Studio was potentially the way to go. And so they initially contacted Bob Able, and he had maybe one, maybe more meetings with them, or in any case, at some point, the latter part of 77, I first was informed about it. Bob told me what was evolving, and I started to attend meetings at that time.
Okay, I want to come around to Robert Able in a moment and move it on from there. But for you, how did you get into design? What was the spark that made you suddenly think, that's the career path I want to go down?
You mean my entire career, or in relation to Star Trek?
No, in relation to coming on board with Robert Able from the start. So you're Richard Taylor, you have a particular talent, and somebody discovers you and says, come and sit by that desk and design something for me, or whatever they said.
Well, my background, my career is pretty varied, and it's long. My father was a career Air Force officer. We lived around the world. I was born in Texas, and then we lived in Rome, New York, and then Japan right after World War II. I saw Nagasaki, a flattened city from an atomic bomb, and we then moved back to Utah, then to Alaska, and I graduated from high school in Dayton, Ohio, because my father was an Air Force pilot, and we moved around. My mother and all my family were from Indiana, and she was an artist, graduated from Butler University, and she could paint and draw and sew, and she made costumes, and she was a huge influence on me and my sister. And when we were young, we took music lessons, even though I played college sports and so forth. I had a calling to the arts in a way. I loved making model airplanes out of balsa wood, and ones that flew, and then plastic models. And I loved to draw, and I had a natural ability, but she pushed that. So I always loved the arts, and I entered competitions when I was in the 6th grade to decorate the small town we were in, and won. And so things were progressing. I started to learn that if there's a job out there that has time and money and a deadline, and somebody needs an idea and a design to get it done, I'll volunteer. So every dance in high school, the senior prom, the yearbook, I was involved in anything that had design and a budget, because most people went, I don't know what to do. So she was a huge influence, and I eventually went to Kings Point, the United States Merchant Marine Academy, which was, I hated every moment of it. But I was following the path of brats of Air Force, Army, Navy officers, or people in the armed forces, to get into one of the federal academies, if you could. Well, I went there, and I hated every moment. And I eventually resigned, and I ended up getting a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting and Drawing from the University of Utah. I was always interested in photography. My mother was a phenomenal photographer and took pictures all the time with 35 millimeter camera, and she had a 16 millimeter camera, and we made home movies all the time. And every time we did, I would get dressed up in some outfit as a cowboy or a pilot or something, and I loved those movies. And when we'd go back to visit my grandparents in the summer, we'd watch them 16 millimeter, and I loved them. My favorite thing of all was watching them in reverse. There was nothing funnier. I didn't think anything was more funny than watching somebody come out of a swimming pool backwards or whatever. Anyway, so I had this affinity to photography and film and drawing and painting, and then making models and so forth. So they all kind of coalesced together. And after I got my Bachelor of Fine Arts at university, I became, you got to remember this was 1964, 65. Okay, 65. I graduated from high school in 1962. And the whole psychedelic hippie tsunami came through our country and changed the world, changed perception. Those of us in the arts, lawyers, the tune in, turn on, drop out thing actually happened to a lot of people. I fell into that and just became enamored with the kind of visuals that created. taking psychedelics. And, I started designing a lot of those posters, graphic posters for that era. And on my website, there's a whole lot of them for the Grateful Dead and Led Zeppelin, the list goes on. And I started a light show and graphics company with another guy named Kenvin, Kenvin Lyman. And he was a fantastic artist. And the first time that I saw a light show, which I believe was Jerry Abrams' light show, he toured with Jefferson Airplane. And it was liquids, on opaque projectors, slides, movie loops, and so forth. But it was this collage of light. And I just was enamored with it immediately because it had a quality. It was made of light. It wasn't paint. It wasn't, a photograph on the wall or any other art form. And it wasn't just a movie. So the process of doing posters and so forth involved lithography. And this was everything we're talking about now was all analog era, because we're going to get to a firewall at some point here, which is Tron, where things became digital. But so the way posters were made is that you drew elements by hand with rapidographs. And so I was very good at mechanical drawing and using a rapidograph, mechanical drawing tools, French curves. I loved in school and at the academy, I loved mechanical drawing, doing orthographic views of an object. For those who are listening, an orthographic view is a front, side view, and a top view of an object. So you can see what it really looks like. And they're in scale to each other. So I love that kind of precision and drawing that way. And so in making posters, you would work with that, and then that artwork would go under a copy camera. A copy camera would look at the artwork and have big pieces of film in it. And the film that was used to create lithographic printing was called high-con film, which means that the film was either totally opaque black or clear. So no light would go through the black area. If you take a piece of color film and hold it up to a light, you can see the black isn't black. It's, it's a dark green, it's whatever. But so lithographic film is totally opaque black. So, and when you shoot something with this copy camera, you can take a big piece of artwork and reduce it down with incredible detail to very small. So I had an epiphany when I saw the show that Kenvin was working on, where he had made from glass plates that he put black asphaltum on, and then he would scratch through with a needle and so then do these drawings, put those down, and they were backlit and projected. He was involved with a really small light show in Utah. And I immediately saw that there was a potential to use high-con film, multiple projectors, line them all up graphically, and basically paint by number with light, or that's the best way I can define it, is these projectors all lined up, so all the artwork lined up, and the color came from filters on the camera's color wheels. So there were, we had 16 ectographic slide projectors and 3 motion picture projectors and a laser and some other things that created our light show and graphics company called Rainbow Jam. And Rainbow Jam was unlike any other light show at all. It really was. And the imagery we hand drew in layers, so all of it lined up. The artwork was reduced down through copy camera to glass slides that were very carefully registered. And so everything lined up, and then all of the projectors and the motion pictures went to some control consoles that we designed and built that allowed us to play keys that turned those images on and off. And we had dimmers that came down to our foot, so we could, each 4 slide projectors made a panoramic that was 1 high by 4 wide. And I had 4 keys on the left hand and 4 on the right, and Kenvin had the same, so we had, we played a certain number of keys, and then those 4 keys created a panoramic, and those 4 keys went down to we converted like musical wah-wah pedals into dimmers by putting silicon controlled rectifiers in there so we could dim the stuff, and when it come down, it hit a micro switch and it would switch, so we could cross dissolve with our feet. And, we could fade something out, fade it back in, and when it went all the way down and we pushed it down far enough, it would change the slide. So we could play this imagery. The projectors had focus on them, and like airbrushing, when you have a real hard edge kind of thing, with an airbrush. As soon as you pull it back, it softens. So focus was kind of airbrushing with light. We could